NRW Talk with Dieter Hermans. Welcome today from the open studio of the EU in Brussels. I warmly welcome an illustrious group here at the table. I'll start with the hostess, that's Manuela Rieper. She is a member of the European Parliament. She is a German lawyer and politician, and since the 16th of July 2020 she is a member of the European Parliament. Welcome. Then we have another female guest at our table, and that is Syria Burley. She comes from Switzerland, from the very high mountain, and she has reached out to leading companies from Switzerland about the tools of the future and their target groups with her company, SwissTalk. By now, welcome.
Mittlerweile führende Unternehmen aus der Schweiz über die Tools der Zukunft und der Zielgruppen erreicht. Herzlich willkommen.
Then we come to the men's round, and there we have Toygar China on my right. His clients also call him the game changer in our. With his company, he advises on current trends in human resources and is now, I would say, a big name on LinkedIn.
Berät mit seinem Unternehmen die aktuellen Trends im HR-Bereich und ist mittlerweile auf LinkedIn, würde ich mal sagen, eine große Nummer.
Thanks.
Then I have Fabian Manka, here on my left. Fabian Manka is now the Pope, or as they say, an IT nerd and computer enthusiast who got into online marketing in the year 2010. Meanwhile, he calls himself an expert in artificial intelligence and automation. Welcome.
Thanks.
And lastly, already known from the last program, Andreas Wallerman, he is also called GE Fluenza. He has made it his task to advise companies on the difference between the generations, with content through visits to social institutions and also, accordingly, I would say, to inform them about the situation of how a GE Fluenza is situated in the companies today. Interesting topics today. We have christened the program, The Clash of Generations, from analog to digital. What is analog and what is digital? I'd say I'll pass it on to Andreas, who actually lives more in the digital world than I do, who lives in the analog one. He also calls me a boomer.
Yes, as a person who, at least in terms of birth cohorts, fits in quite well in this area of boomers. Yes, and indeed the conflict of generations, and when we talk about the fact that we are changing from analog to digital, we experience this in many areas. You said so beautifully in the introduction that visiting schools makes a big difference, and also visiting universities, but also looking back at our own lives often shows that we have experienced differences in the upbringing of the generations. We have the analog world, where we still know how to be out and about, where we really did get information and knowledge in doses and for a limited time, and we are just noticing that in this Generation Z, the youngest generation, 1994 to 2010, who are now entering the labor market with great urgency and changing the world, that digitalization has also changed a lot. This brings a lot of perspectives and possibilities, but also perhaps causes some confusion for the older generations in the analog world.
Exactly, we were in human resources. We have the absolute expert sitting at the table. Toygar, what's your take on this?
There are already serious differences. You can see them between younger and older cohorts. Of course, there are many challenges that we actually have to overcome. The difference is then noticeable in the use of the digital analog world, which does not mean that it is always quite as dramatic as portrayed in the media. So there are also quite good improvements and also possibilities to build bridges there.
In our preliminary conversation, I was a bit startled by Toygar's statement. Formerly Rolex, now Warm Island.
Exactly, that is indeed the case. So we have had a change in values for a few years. It has become clear. There has always been a change in cross-generational issues, but now this change in values has come along. You used to recognize successful managers in the 80s and 90s by their status symbols, like cars, Rolexes, six-figure bonuses, and today that's becoming a little less important. Young people, especially Generation Z, may not want that. That doesn't mean they don't respond to it. It's just different today. The luxury is maybe a 4-day week, or maybe working from a warm island and not having to sit in an office like your parents might have done. So there's also the change in values in emotional value, but also in monetary value.
Manuela, what would it be like if you could work as a parliamentarian from a warm island?
Yes, during the corona pandemic, many people actually did that. I know a company boss who worked from the Bahamas. Very interesting, nice for him. I have to say quite honestly. But we also found out, we might come back to analog and digital, that during the coronal pandemic many things were transferred to the digital world. It was good, you saved time, you didn't have to travel so much. That was the positive thing. You could work from home, but finally when corona died down a bit, when people met in analog form again, like we do today, then you realize that it is a completely different way of being together, and you have recognized the value of sitting next to someone, looking someone in the eye and not via a computer screen. So I think the analog has become even more valuable after you have gone through this phase of digitalization.
You are a mother. How do you see your offspring?
That is this huge balancing act that we have to manage nowadays, both as mothers, as fathers, but perhaps also as politicians. What do we do? I mean, digitalization has a lot of advantages. We will hear it from the expert on artificial intelligence. We just have to be careful that the boundaries don't shift too much towards digitalization, because it has advantages, but it also has enormous disadvantages, especially for young children. So when we see how much time they spend in front of the mobile phone, what all the consequences are. For example, news is now coming out of Japan that children are spending too much time on small screens, which means that their vision is getting worse. This leads to blindness, and these are of course dangers that exist, apart from the fact that they naturally move less, that they are also disturbed in their concentration by looking too long at the screen, that they no longer play outside, which of course extremely promotes creativity. We have to be very careful not to go too much in the direction of digitalization and then neglect the analog.
Thank you, Manuela. You have already mentioned that Fabian, our expert for artificial intelligence, explained it again in detail. I was impressed with him because one day we had a pre-call Zoom conference and he was there as an avatar. But the facial expressions and also his expression were almost like the normal present, as if he was sitting in front of me, which is actually a bit scary. How do you judge, let's say, these conferences now and also the whole story with Meta and what's coming up? That's just a bit scary.
Yes, of course it is, because it is unusual and we are not used to it in this way. I am also of the opinion that we have to be careful that we don't bring in too little digitalization. I also have a 2-year-old son. We also make sure that he is outside a lot and that he has little contact with the mobile phone. Of course, this is also extremely important. But we must not miss this point where it is really important to carry out targeted support and to take measures to ensure that young people are also supported in digitization and digital topics.
Yes, we were already in the digital world in the area of artificial intelligence. And of course we also have another specialist who is more active on TikTok, namely Syria. Your experience, you advise well-known companies, like big airlines in Switzerland and so on. How do they react to that? How do you lead in there?
Basically, it's always about what do you want to show a target group, and then the second question, how do you do that? In the end, it's all about how to get something across. How does communication work? Because no matter what kind of message you have, you can get it across in many different ways, and that is often the problem. I would say that the challenge is how to get the message across, and as soon as you understand how to do that, then these points come up. That you don't get into a conflict because someone misunderstands something. And this is the topic on which we advise companies.
Are young people already so far on TikTok that they can give companies a reach?
Definitely, you can see that many companies are successful on TikTok. Not because they think, cool, a company is on TikTok, but because they think, hey, the company understands us, the company talks in our language, and that is exactly the point. Companies need to speak in the language of the target group and not in their own language. That's the only way they can reach them.
I now ask myself the question, does the school system of the analog world only create workers now? Andreas?
That is an exciting question, and I think we need to break it down a bit. The school system has been around for a very long time and it has worked for a long time. Looking back, we can say that a lot of things have worked. We live in a great country where many things are positive. We create entrepreneurs, we create self-confidence, and others envy us for that. But we also have to consider whether we have underestimated digitalization to a certain extent, in other words, whether we have also underestimated how the various age groups deal with digitalization. In the past, at the beginning of digitalization, we are talking about large periods of time. Access to digitalization was only possible for companies. Today, we see that more than 90% of Generation Z, in particular, use smartphones. That means we have a situation today where everyone is able to use digital media. There are no longer these qualitative issues: who doses, who makes this interaction possible, what do I watch or not? So I conduct interviews with young people of Generation Z.
In schools,
in institutions, visits to social institutions, outside of schools, are also exciting to get a picture of the mood.
Example:
Visiting a youth home, visiting the mobile social service and talking to the young people there in youth homes. What are their issues? What moves them? Then you hear a lot of exciting voices. And to come back to the topic, we have missed in the school system, but also in many analog professions, to use the digitalization around the topic of visibility for us. And even such a school system, which is supposed to prepare young people for life, has currently failed to take digitization with all the topics that are important for life today to some extent. We had Corona, which was once again the fast lane of digitalization, where we knew how to use these technologies in all areas of the company in many ways. Unfortunately, very often we lack the speed in a school system to prepare people, especially young people, for what all this entails.
Has Corona changed the digital age?
I don't think it's the digital age that has changed, but the openness of people and companies to simply using these tools. We were often in a situation in the past where we wanted to know what a person was doing. So this control in the profession was often only possible when employees were on site. In digitalization, not. Digitalization has been around for a long time and the possibilities have also been around for a long time. We have only missed the step into this digitalization, for often understandable reasons. But these young people, the 90% who use it every day for 4 to 10 hours, are permanently inside and get completely different information. You can always ask yourself whether the school system here is suitable for preparing people for life or not.
Yes, Manuela, you are also a politician and a lawyer who also suffers from a lack of time, so to speak. Do you think that the value of time has changed due to analog and digital?
With digitalization, life is becoming more and more fast-paced. Before, you might have had time between 2 meetings. I needed time to get to the second meeting first. But nowadays it's one meeting after the other. And very interesting, to come back to Corona, in the beginning the world stood still. Suddenly no one knew what to do. You suddenly had more time for walks or anything else. But then people got the hang of it and suddenly, there was one conference after another, and you were even more stressed than before. That's why I say everything has its advantages, or disadvantages. And you just mentioned targeted support, and I agree with that. But when does this support start? And what exactly do children need to be given so that they can handle it properly? I think we need media competence at home, we need media competence at school and also in our free time. So that the children who have the internet at their disposal and can look at everything and are bombarded with information from all sides, so that they can also filter out what corresponds to reality here and what is fake news here, because that is also a big problem that digitalization brings with it.
Do you think that the school system is still appropriate in this age of abundant knowledge and information?
If we look at the school system, we see the development towards a curriculum that is getting fuller and fuller, that teaches more and more mathematics, more and more German, that overwhelms the students more and more. And what has unfortunately decreased in the curricula are subjects like music, like sport, like art. So that means giving the children a balance, not to have to learn all the time, but also to deal with the pressure. How can I release pressure? How can I occupy myself in a different way? And that has decreased, I think. In this respect, the curriculum should be looked at again, so that the children also have an emphasis on the arts, artistic subjects and sports, because they are just as important.
Interesting topic for Andreas too, who is always fully involved. Do you think the current school system is suitable?
If I'm honest, maybe that has nothing to do with today. Anyone who was a student knows that it wasn't really what prepared them for the future. But I think we are at a threshold. Digitalization in particular simply makes it necessary, just like dealing with the media, perhaps also sensitivity. How do I cope with this? But also quite honestly requires that we first start to create openness and empowerment among those involved by opening up areas where the young people show the teachers what the current topics are. Creating an openness for what moves them, what they want to do in school, and that is important not only in school but also in companies. Toygar got to know great areas there. In a preliminary discussion, he said young people go into human resources and point out which issues are relevant. And I think that's what it's all about, listening to understand what the problems of young people are and how we can now connect them. One number in the current statistics I find a little disturbing at the moment. It's the fact that statistically every day about 1,800 people live to be 18 years old, but there are 3,500 people who turn 65 every day. This means that we lose twice as much life experience and experience in dealing with defeats, with sensitive topics that we do not get back so quickly. And now is the time to tackle this, and this togetherness is very important, from my point of view.
You mentioned the human resources sector, quite rightly. You have to say that when you listen to the media and read the media, you actually learn that we are looking for specialized staff. For me, skilled personnel is personnel with experience. Can the young generation do that at all?
A very short but very complex question. So it really starts in education. I would like schools to teach something like soft skills, like personality development or what empathy is. How do I present in a team, and how do I perhaps fight against different opinions without arguing, and how do I become more resilient? We have to learn that first, at school, and not always just ask whether you have read Faust by Goethe, which is also important. I don't want to question that at all. But for what's coming now, that's something completely different. I was just about to tell Manuela about digitalization. The danger is not that the child sits on the tablet for almost 16 hours. The danger is that the father or mother have no idea what danger it can be for the child. In other words, we are punishing young people because we ourselves do not know how to deal with digitalization and the possibilities, which can be channeled. To come back to your question, today we see that many young people are not even aware of their abilities. It's very easy to say you can and want change, but the understanding of how to implement it is often not there. And for companies, it is exactly the other side that needs to be examined. Then you also have to be courageous. Then you also have to say, what are the skilled workers today that there used to be in the 80s? That no longer exists today. Today's professionals want flexibility. They want freedom of choice, autonomy. They want a culture of making mistakes without the fear that there will be consequences if you spend €10,000 out of your budget and the return is not there. These are experiences. We also have to give people the chance to make new experiences. We have to draw on old experiences, but at the same time leave room for new experiences, so that people can exchange with each other, because the foundations have changed. That's what we're missing. It's often the debate between analog and or digital, old or young, experienced or inexperienced, but in between there's a very broad mass where we can exchange ideas. I think this debate is more important, especially in the world of work, which is completely overlooked at the moment.
Sylvia, you are a young entrepreneur and also our youngest participant here at the table. Your experience, how did you approach all these companies to win them as customers?
Exciting and short question, but still perhaps complicated. Basically, I think it's important that young people are aware that you are perceived the way you present yourself. If you go there insecurely, then you come across as an insecure person and you might not be treated equally, or maybe not taken seriously. But if you say right from the start, these are my topics, I am an expert in them, and not only speak, but also show it, actions are much stronger than words. If you show how something works, then you have the necessary respect, which is always needed to be at eye level with your counterpart. I believe that if you can do that and show how, what and why something works, then you get, for example, bigger customers and bigger partnerships.
And how do you achieve this respect?
Exactly.
Nobody is listening.
I'm not talking about LinkedIn posts where you say, I've achieved this, this and this, but with actions. How did we implement what? Showing expertise, insights and sharing. Not only with some superficial LinkedIn posts or social media posts in which you present yourself as an expert, but also show this expertise. Because what I have found, I find very unfortunate, it is often said that the boomers are not open to it or Generation Z is not understood and so on, but it is a counterplay. So first of all, the older generation would have to approach the younger, i.e. want to understand the younger, but also the other way round in exactly the same way. I can't talk to a friend the way I would talk to someone from an older generation. Here you first have to find yourself. It is not black and white, but it is also something in between. And as soon as both generations understand that, then we manage to have this discussion, which is also so valuable to learn something.
That's right, thank you. Of course I also have respect for artificial intelligence, I have to say, and Fabian is our expert here. And he claims that he writes books with artificial intelligence, like an author or writer. How should I imagine that?
In principle, artificial intelligence has learned how authors, how writers, how all kinds of other people write texts. It has learned what it takes to write humanly, how to form sentences, how to form correct grammar, but also how to write emotionally. What it means to write aggressively, what it means to be kind, positive, negative, all these things, all these emotions, the artificial intelligence has learned and understood.
How does artificial intelligence learn this?
By taking our human texts as a basis, that is, it has a database, has been fed with data, based on the internet, and there are very many texts written by humans. World literature, songs, all these things the artificial intelligence has in its database, it has learned the texts, and has formed a pattern from them, which ultimately means all this, and thus it can also implement this itself. This means that if a text was previously formulated positively, for example, then the next time the artificial intelligence knows that it is formulated positively and can also formulate new texts in this way.
You have experience from the Frankfurt Book Fair. Did you get on well there with your artificial intelligence?
So, well, there are very open publishers, there definitely are, but in general it's of course old-fashioned, to put it that way.
Old mentality.
Yes, exactly. The interest comes more from entrepreneurship, for example, or people who are really interested in technology, or simply dyslexics, for example, or people with other origins for whom German is simply the second or third language. Such people are naturally very interested in using such technology because it enables them to achieve something that they would otherwise not be able to.
But with a normal book, I have something tangible. You also have the books printed, they are not only e-books.
Exactly.
But when an author writes that, he has certain emotions that come across. Can artificial intelligence do that too?
Yes, that's why there is a so-called briefing. That means that in this briefing I feed the artificial intelligence with exactly this information. I explain to it what I expect from the text that is then generated. how it should be structured, if necessary, which formulations should appear in it, if that's what I want. So all this information that I would give to an employee who writes a text for me, for example, or to a ghostwriter or another copywriter, I also give to the artificial intelligence so that it can then implement it.
Manuela, would you let artificial intelligence write a speech for Parliament?
I listen with great astonishment, because I didn't quite understand it. Does the artificial intelligence then simply copy thoughts that have already existed, that existed in the data with which it was fed?
No.
Or does it develop its own ideas, its own creativity?
Yes.
It can then formulate a surprising ending itself.
Exactly.
One it didn't get.
That's exactly how it is. So there are various studies by various universities. Cambridge or Harvard, for example, have all analyzed this and found that over 99.9% of the result is unique content that does not even exist on the internet in this form.
Frightening, because then the next question would be, why do we still need humans if the computer can do it?
That is exactly the point, which is why my thesis is that those who do not deal with artificial intelligence and such technologies will be replaced.
If we don't prevent that.
If we don't stop this.
So coming back to your question, I prefer to write my speeches myself rather than leave it to a computer.
A second idea would be to see it as a source of inspiration, simply to generate ideas on the basis of which I can also develop my own texts, so I can also see it as a source of ideas.
Of course, but then that's already an ethical thing again. I mean, do I want to accept ideas from a machine that has simply been fed information, so to speak?
That's what we do every day. In the end, a smartphone is exactly the same. No smartphone would really work without artificial intelligence. Actually, nothing digital would work without artificial intelligence. We just don't notice. Even when I speak something into my phone, artificial intelligence is already working in the background.
Yes, but I don't tell the mobile phone to draft a text for me when I speak into it. It's still my own ideas.
Right.
I get it. Artificial intelligence has many advantages. It can help us to generate technological progress. But when it comes to creativity and our own thoughts, I would not like to leave it to machines.
Okay.
I agree with you, I can honestly say. A question for Andreas. Boomers see themselves as the best generation. They don't want to hand over the scepter. I heard that from you once.
I wouldn't take this thesis so seriously either. What strikes me, and that also fits very well into this topic of artificial intelligence, is a certain skepticism. Maybe it makes sense to talk about it again. What does boomer mean anyway? We had baby boomers who entered the labor market with large numbers. That was still the analog world. And the only factor that is the same for everyone, the time factor, it is the same for each of us, no matter what social structure we come from. We had to spend a lot of time in the analog world to get knowledge. It just took more time to get information. If it didn't work out at school, I had the opportunity to do it in the library. If a scholar wanted to sacrifice his time for me, he gave me more knowledge than was there before, and it simply took longer to get it. Then, of course, the question of status played a very different role. So few jobs, many people, I get one of those few jobs with status, with elbow, mentality, that does something to a person. Then you think, now I have a job, which often explains why a lot of people stay in a job for 20 or 30 years, because there used to be this belief that you have a good job, and it's difficult to get a better one, so just stay there. Then we noticed that the generations had changed. Mechanization has changed, we have digitization, which makes many things possible, but also people in decision-making positions who find it difficult. Those who often see the conflict in the generations in such a way that everything that came after it will not be so good at first, because we have this flood of information. An endless flood of content, young people who are currently online 4 to 10 hours a day, who travel up to 180 meters with their thumbs and are always filled with information. The quality is no longer what it used to be, that's often the point. This has always worked very well in the past, and what the future will bring, what artificial intelligence can really do, is doubted. Especially when we look at many exciting theses, artificial intelligence, for example, that we no longer have to write texts ourselves, but have to speak them. As a result, grammar is lost, we are no longer able to write sensible texts ourselves. This is a certain fear of the older generation, which naturally asks itself the question, after all it has achieved in the past, are the young people even capable of carrying on as we have done?
Question to the game changer: how can the boomer hold his ground in HR these days?
It's not a question of boomers versus younger generation. It's never a blanket statement. But I think everything has been said. So communication. Yes, we have to reach out to the others. The added value is there through the wealth of experience that has been gathered over the years. This should also be passed on. But young people should also be given the freedom to make something new out of the knowledge passed on, or let them decide for themselves how to use it. Most of the time we are taught something by the elderly, and then they say, do it exactly like this. This is no longer possible, neither through communication nor through technical possibilities. These conflicts usually arise when a generation skips, i.e. Generation Z and the boomers. Because in between are the millennials and Generation X. They are too far apart, and of course the interest is not there and the fronts are immediately hardened. Conversely, of course, people can be expected to say, I've figured out the solution to a problem, but I'd like to hear from others who've been down this road if maybe my road is too long, where I can maybe shorten it, where I can save resources. It always stands and falls with the way we want to communicate and that we value being able to communicate. On the other hand, there are of course also fears. I can understand that, and a lot of people have told me that. Older people often fear that they have arrived at the end of the value chain. At some point came the saying, after retirement nothing comes anymore, then you can only enjoy. And with young people it's, clear the way. But if you get involved in these mind games, then it becomes more of a struggle. You shouldn't, because the added value is still there. We also see this in the world of work. It's not that companies don't look for older people, but the companies think that if they take the older person, he will probably demand a lot of money. That also comes into it. And with young people, you don't get the performance, but you save a lot of money. And Germany as a business location must create many more opportunities so that this gap does not arise. It is actually the creation of value, both intellectual and emotional, that can still be lived out between the generations.
Syria, when you look at digitization in Switzerland and Germany, are there differences?
I think if you look at youth, it's pretty similar. Sure, if you compare us with other continents, there is a difference, but I would say it's very similar in Switzerland and Germany. They are exactly the same challenges, exactly the same issues.
And when will you move to the warm island?
Yes, regarding the island and other values, it definitely is. You also have to consider that there used to be no way to work remotely, it wasn't even known. Accordingly, one did not have this desire at all. You'd rather have a nice watch, a great car. It's not that young people don't want that, but you now see other options and just prioritize things differently, and that's totally fine too.
Of course, you also have to take climate change into account. Manuela, the school system in Germany is lagging behind a bit. When I hear that some schools don't even have tablets to work with, for example. How do the politicians see the future? I mean, there are very clever suggestions, but some of them are not implemented.
Yes, a lot of wise advice is unfortunately very often not implemented in politics, but especially in the area of digitalization. It would be very negligent if politics did not act in schools, because as we have seen, digitalization is simply part of it nowadays. The children must be taken by the hand. They must be specifically supported. They must be given the opportunity to deal with digitalization, to deal with it properly. Therefore, it is very important that schools take this into account more and more. Unfortunately, we have no influence on education policy at European level. This is still a matter for the member states alone, but I can only call for the topic to be taken up and promoted here at school. I would like to mention another aspect, because you just asked, what does it take as a young person to face a company, to convince them that you have these new skills that the company needs? And I think the buzzword here is of course good self-esteem, but I wonder whether digitalization and social media promote this self-esteem, or whether they don't rather lead many young people, especially young girls, to doubt themselves. When I talk to young people, they also confess that they actually only look at themselves with these filters on their mobile phones, because these filters beautify everything. That means they enter a reality, a virtual reality, that doesn't exist in reality. And that raises the question of how all this social media affects young people's self-esteem. Of course, we also have to be careful that young people don't lose themselves in a virtual world where there are no defeats that are important for maturing, but where there are only happy people who party and have 1,000 friends. So these are also dangers, and that would also be the question whether one should address the young people in school. How do you present yourselves? Is that really you? What should you pay attention to? Or how should you present yourselves?
Right, I agree with you there.
That's the shift in cool during puberty. It happened 30 years ago that very young girls started to wear makeup at some point and then came to school with makeup on. And those who perhaps didn't have access to makeup, or where that wasn't possible at home, always felt a little uglier. Just like the boys who were always very popular in gym class and the non-sporty boys were the successful ones only later. So that's just shifted to a different terrain. Because now the follower numbers might already make an impression, and maybe that's why you think someone is prettier. But we also know what Photoshop can do. So we need to think more often and say, that's not bad. With talent in Photoshop and a decent mouse you can do that too. This striving to be more beautiful, faster, better, that has always existed.
But back to the subject of the parental home, how important it is that parents think their way into it, so they are much more attentive to what the children are doing and just get a feel for it. We see this often.
Quickly pressed into the hand.
Exactly, that's often a distraction. We've already talked about how, in order to get some free time, parents give their cell phones to young children and say, I need a little rest. But I'm much more concerned with getting a feeling for what my children are doing.
It must be an iPhone.
This is basically the world of unlimited possibilities of the internet. I can position myself as I want. I can also break out of my own reality. Maybe that is also a point that makes a big difference for many young people I talk to in schools. Not only do we have sunshine everywhere, we also have social issues. Corona did not contribute to the well-being of young people because the institutions that offered hot food for lunch, or where someone listened with interest, were closed. You were locked up at home in the digital world, where such an influencer, or whoever, showed me a beautiful world that I could just escape to. In other words, the point is precisely that we have many participants, but where we depend above all on this cooperation, that in the end we all trust, listen and enable each other to deal with it sensitively.
Perhaps on this subject, as you said, we know what Photoshop does, but I think the big problem is that a lot of people don't know. And then the question is, where is the education? How do you have to educate? Does the responsibility lie with the parents? Or does it lie with the schools? I often observe that the responsibility is always shifted away. The school has to do it. No, the parents have to do it, and the victim is ultimately the young generation that suffers. In the end, it's like this. You know what Photoshop does, and if you know it, you can understand it. But many don't know, and therein lies the great danger. The question is how to communicate it properly so that the younger generation also understands it.
Good question, you are the TikTok expert. It's a question of good and bad, I would say. Some of the things that are posted are really devastating. Fortunately, TikTok filters them a bit. What impact does that have on businesses? You have to assume that they say, we don't want to go in there.
I think social media in general has the danger that you see things you don't want to see, that you see things you shouldn't see.
Yes.
It's the same with TikTok. You have it on Instagram, you have it on LinkedIn. Ultimately, the question is, what do you want to bring to the platform yourself and how? And yes, the education of the young target group, who can be influenced more quickly. You have to educate them that when they see something that basically doesn't belong on a platform, they're influenced in such a way that they draw consequences from it. For example, that they feel they are not good enough or don't look so perfect. I don't have such a perfect life, I don't live on a nice island and so on.
Yes, Fabian, is there GE-fluenza in the meta world?
Yes and no, so actually less. I wanted to say something briefly about Syria. I believe that the platform operators have a responsibility and that it is also important that the operators are held accountable when certain things happen that simply should not happen. That should be made clear to the platforms.
That it's not so easy to spy on data. Because that is also something where you become a victim, when everyone spies on your data, and then passes it on to the corresponding companies, so that they can then target their advertising.
Maybe an interim question, we're talking about TikTok, we have the story with China. Are companies saying they don't want that?
I think the companies I talk to already have this information. For example, they say it's not a problem for them. But just like you said, it is important to be aware of where the information goes, what happens on the platform, what the platform does. Of course, the platform bears the responsibility, but it is exactly the same. Not only the platform bears the responsibility.
Sure.
I can't say the platform has to do it, but I use it anyway.
Everyone.
But if you are aware of this, you can also make a conscious decision as a company to do so or not.
Yes, Fabian, are there GE-fluenzas in the meta world?
Actually, even less. On the one hand, this is certainly due to the fact that a virtual reality headset is still relatively expensive. You start at around €300 for such a headset if you want to use it properly. There is also the possibility to use this on the computer, but of course it is 2D and less attractive, I say now, than in the real 3D world, with the 3D headset. That's one point. The next point is that the content is simply not yet intended for Generation Z, apart from the games. So there is the business context, which is where I mainly spend my time, in virtual conference rooms, to exchange ideas, to discuss things, to hold workshops, all that kind of thing. But apart from games and the workshops, there is still relatively little that could then appeal to Generation Z.
But for relaxation I can walk my digital dog there.
That is possible, of course, of course. Yes, there are certainly also things, but I am less represented there now, such social media platforms in virtual reality, that also exists of course.
Yes, digital and analog, there we have the topic for Andreas.
But I find that exciting, it shows how many perspectives we have, what beliefs there have been in the past, and I actually believe that work will simply change as a value. We are currently noticing that many companies have understood how to respond to this workation value among young people by ensuring that they are a workplace, but at the same time a feel-good space, a holiday oasis, the warm island that you create in a company, because that is simply important to young people. And in the end I think, this is a thesis of mine, we know it from the analog world. I've seen enough people working there 5 days a week for 8 hours at a stretch and also being on site, but being incredibly unproductive. I can also, and Corona has shown this again, use the home office option and give people that confidence. A 4-day week can be very effective. I just have to have the courage and openness to look at these future trends and implement them for my staff if that's what my staff want. If that's what young people want, if those are really the issues. And we often find, I hear this in conversations with companies, that there is a football table or a fruit basket and they think they are doing a lot for their employees. But that's what everyone does because it's a trend. But you don't do it to understand what the people in the company need to give everything to make the company and themselves successful.
Okay. What about in the human resources sector? Is home office in demand?
Yes. But it's not a black and white debate either. It's about flexibility, nothing more. The point is, so anyone who has Saturdays off and has to go to the supermarket knows the problem. It's always crowded. It's about flexibility, about deciding for yourself how you work, when you work, what you work on and from where. In many professions it doesn't hurt. So you can decide for yourself if you want to work from home one day so you can maybe pick up the kids earlier or do the shopping or prepare something for the party at the weekend. That is what it is all about. What is not being created, however, is clear communication. As a company, you still think that you have to offer everything, but that's not true. As a company, you just have to say, we can't offer more than 2 days of home office here. That's what we can do, please choose that. It makes a difference whether you only offer home office on Mondays and Wednesdays, or whether everyone is allowed to work from home 2 days a week. It's a completely different story, a completely different challenge for people and has something to do with autonomy. It is always wanted, and I must honestly say that we filled more positions for companies this year than in the last 2 years combined. But we did not manage to fill more positions with the top candidates this year because there was a flexible hybrid solution or a desire, and the company could not or did not want to do that. Then you can't be surprised. You don't pay the salaries for skilled workers, you don't provide the working environment, you don't create the desired atmosphere, and then to say we have a shortage of skilled workers, you make a difficult argumentative story out of it.
Why don't companies want that?
There is everything. So if we make a very steep thesis, most leaders just don't have a clue about leadership when you are in front of each other or next to each other. And then it is very difficult or even impossible to lead from a distance. That comes along with fear, loss of control and, of course, excessive demands on the legal basis, because many companies simply do not understand that a home office is also a workplace and that you might have to spend money and provide reasonable equipment. It is not enough to tell employees to use their own laptops. Then I have data security problems, privacy problems. You can't control how much the person works then. It's not for nothing that statistics say that people who work in a pure home office work on average at least 3 hours more per month than people who are in the office, with a productivity increase of 21%. If I can't monitor and coordinate all this and the effort is too great, then I'd rather have everyone come to the office, then it's uniform and I don't have to pretend. To a certain extent, the lack of own flexibility, of course.
Syria, as a dynamic Swiss entrepreneur, do people from the older generation envy you?
Gibt es Neid bei dir von den älteren Generationen?
It's hard to say. If I'm completely honest, I think you can find something to envy in every generation, the older ones in the younger ones, but also vice versa. When it comes to digitalization, for example, I can imagine that many older people envy the young people because they can quickly set up a WLAN, like technicians. But it's the same the other way round, that maybe they also had peace and quiet because we're bombarded with news all the time, with new information, with social media news and so on. And the older generations didn't have that at all. I think there is envy, but I don't think only from the older to the younger, also the other way round. And that is also something beautiful, because it means that there are differences between the generations and you learn from differences.
And do you feel the envy yourself? Be honest, no one hears.
No one is watching. I'll put it this way. There are many more people who want to treat you to something and give you something to take with you on your way. I think it always depends on how you take something. Do you take it directly as envy, or is it perhaps really advice from experience? What strikes me, and I find this very regrettable, is that young people have the feeling that when an older generation says something, they know better because of their age. But I think that in most cases this is not the case at all. That it is not envy, but they want to do something good because they have other experiences. It may well be that it doesn't apply to the situation at all, and it's not really helpful because the situation is quite different, but the will or the thought behind it is quite different. So envy, yes, but I think it's misunderstood even more often.
Unfortunately, the time is slowly coming to an end and we are coming to a conclusion. Manuela, what do you draw from this discussion we had today and what is your position on analog and digital?
Both are important and we have to try to combine both well, because we have just talked about digitalization. Of course, the home office has advantages, the flexibility, but we also had the discussion here in the European Parliament, because we wanted to learn the lessons from the corona pandemic and maybe also draw the good from it. That would have been better for a work-life balance, even for politicians, especially if you have young children, to better reconcile them. It was very difficult to achieve. I failed. I have to say that quite honestly. And I also failed because of older women who didn't want that. Those who said, we have to do it as before, who did not want any changes. I think it's really bad, because we need a better work-life balance, also to attract young women to politics. We have a lot of great young women, and they should be aware of that and not say, I can't. I have little kids. I can't reconcile this. We should abolish that. But what was also very important, yes, it brings more flexibility. But you also have to have the right to simply turn off the computer. Now I am at home and now I am not available. So we have to pay a lot of attention to that. So we have to combine both, because both are important in our lives nowadays, and we have to manage to combine both well and see the dangers, but also the advantages.
Then over to Syria again, even before the gentlemen take their turn, your conclusion.
I think everything has advantages and disadvantages, and you should be careful not to see something only from one side, but look at what the advantages are and what you can get out of it. What are the disadvantages and how can I improve something? If you can do that, then that is exactly the point where you have a win-win situation.
Thank you, Fabian.
I also think that above all we have to be understanding and also show understanding for the other generation. You really have to look with respect at why they are doing what they are doing and how we can agree, how we can find a consensus. And I think if there is more understanding in both generations, or in all generations, then we can also find agreements, but first there really has to be understanding.
Do you also mean in politics?
Even in politics, of course, we are all human beings.
Then you two need to talk again in private right away. Okay, Game Changer Toiga, your conclusion for this round.
So in the working world, we have to communicate a lot with each other, be very open, very tolerant and also very resilient. We have overslept a lot. That's just the way it is, and trench warfare leads nowhere. But here, too, politics is needed, at least in Germany, to create the legal framework so that we can reconcile all, or as many as possible, interests between all generations.
An example maybe.
For example, home office regulation or 4-day week. The 4-day week can be implemented more quickly, but it fails when we fall ill or when it goes to the labor court. With a 4-day week I can write something different on the employment contract than with a 5-day week. But when I stand before the labor court, the judge still wants to know how many hours the person worked. I can't say I'm measuring results here and not time. Unfortunately, that's not possible yet. And then politics has to do something. Otherwise, Germany is a good location. We have many advantages, but we run the risk of missing the boat in Europe, which would be a great pity, because Portugal, Spain, Croatia and even England after Brexit have introduced the 4-day week, have better bandwidths on the internet, have implemented home office regulations quickly and in some cases make startups much faster for young people who do not want to go into corporations, who want to become self-employed. And they have also legislated that managing directors or managers are no longer allowed to contact their employees late at night, that overtime is managed quite differently, that generally much more attention has to be paid to mental health. In Germany, we indulge in a bit of nostalgia and say we can do it again. Yes, we can definitely do a lot more than we think. But I think there's no harm in showing society that you care and want change, because otherwise it will be tight.
Thank you. Andreas, your turn.
I think this round is great, especially to hear such different perspectives, where you just realize how useful it is to listen to the young people for once and trust them a bit. To completely leave out these blanket judgments and just listen to the young people. And then you understand that it's only possible together anyway. We live in a world of digitalization in which we receive content continuously and without end. And that in the meantime in many areas, we have also switched to English. This means that if we look beyond Germany, we have high potential that is in demand, and if we don't catch up a bit again, then we have completely different issues than not getting along with each other. Then we will lose a lot of potential in Germany as a business location to other countries, and we will have completely different problems. We still have the chance to listen to each other, to approach each other, and to trust each other. I think that is the best summary of this discussion, that we can only make it together.
I would like to thank the roundtable very much. It was a very interesting conversation. Two worlds collided. Nevertheless, it didn't crash. There was no bang. And apart from that, I would like to wish our viewers a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and stay healthy. Thank you very much.
This is the hour, the darkest place. It's a good world, good world gone bad. It's a good world.